all the way down the end, and I'll take the over this way. Yeah? Yep, take a left.
All right, Dad, I'll talk to you later.
So, Brown, how do you feel after the court?
We originally got the call around 2 o'clock in the morning, of the house fire. And it was a normal house fire. It was believed, unknown if anybody was in the residence at the time, but the firemen were putting out the fire. And shortly after 6 o'clock in the morning, it was discovered that there was a body up a laneway across from the house, at which time additional personnel were called out, and that's when all the investigators went to the scene. The fire, of course, got put out by the firemen, and a lot of the evidence got destroyed in the fire, any usable evidence that we might have been able to find in there, but we knew we had a homicide at that time covered up by an arson. It was quite gruesome. We'd been to seminars on different kinds of homicides, and this was definitely overkill.
The body was soon identified as Sabina Kulikowski. The Cayuga County social worker had lived alone in the farmhouse on Blanchard Road, owned by the family of her estranged boyfriend, Ron Bench.
The murder of Sabina Kulikowski was horrific by the standards of anyone that lived in Cayuga County at that time.
She had the bite marks on her, the body's nude. The perpetrator is going to the house in the middle of the night and seeming to know their way around, and something went on in that house. Something went wrong. She was left upstairs, probably either believed to be dead or unconscious. Then the house was set on fire. It was learned later that the fire originated or was started right inside the front door at the foot of the stairs. And that, of course, would be, to cover up the crime. And she's in there, and it'll get rid of destroy the body and a lot of evidence. And she, at some point, discovers that she's got to get out of that house. She's starting to inhale smoke, and something terrible's probably happened to her. And she hopes that the perpetrator's gone, but she's got no choice. She's got to get out of that house. I believe that it appeared that she came right down through the front door and out, hoping that the assailant or the perpetrator of the crime was long gone, but apparently he wasn't, and She was reconfronted on the roadway, at which time her T-shirt went into the ditch, and she was then dragged down this laneway where she was viciously stabbed numerous times.
This was uncontrollable rage. I mean, many of Sabina's injuries were post-mortem.
It became very obvious that there was some sort of maniac loose, and there was a lot of shock. There was a lot of pressure to solve this crime.
Even the authorities were surprised to be investigating a murder in this small upstate New York village.
It's highly unusual. It does shock the residents of the area. It shocks me. I'm not used to anything like this.
Her friends and family could not believe what had happened in the night.
We were all really angry. She was such a good person. She was slender. She was pixie-like, I would say almost, but not small. You know, slender, blonde, short hair, vivacious, funny. She was on the right side, as we would say, the correct side. She had the right attitude about things. She wasn't a hard-nosed social worker, you know, like you see in the movies and all that. She was very sensitive and cared a lot about the kids and the families that she was working with.
And this woman, you know, was very well liked by social workers or co-workers, law enforcement. They all knew her, and then to have died under these circumstances, it was a very shocking crime that needed to be solved, and solved quickly.
Cayuga County Sheriff's investigator Jerry Shook, Under Sheriff Richard Noga, Deputy Steve McLeod, Deputy John Lamphere, and DA's investigator Peter Pinckney became the main investigative team. Pinckney and Noga were also running against each other in the upcoming Cayuga County Sheriff's election.
Initially, hundreds of photographs are going to be taken, diagrams, measurements taken, all the scenes got to be laid out. We were taking aerial photographs. The body has to be packaged, removed to the county morgue for the autopsy. The bite marks on the body were just so perfect. Every tooth in the person's head was imprinted on her body, both top and lower. She'd been stabbed numerous times. As we looked around, we discovered that there was a T-shirt involved that was discarded. You could visibly see different stain marks and what those stains were. Could have been anything, saliva, semen. There was also even melted plastic on the T-shirt.
As the investigation continued, the grief felt by Sabina Kulikowski's friends and family turned to anger.
Well, the anger was who would do such a thing to such a nice person? You know, it's just a random act of violence, apparently. And then we heard the name Roy Brown.
They were able to identify this individual who threatened social workers, who had just gotten out of prison. He was considered a bad man in just about everybody's eyes. And they were able to try to piece together a scenario. They figured out how this crime took place, and they made their arrest.
That Roy Brown drew a lot of attention to himself in 1991. He was a violent man with a violent past. He did not provide for his children, and the Child Protective Services took him away from him. He became angry and threatened to kill a social worker. 4 to 6 days after he's out of jail, after serving a sentence for the threats, a social worker ends up brutally murdered.
Prior to Brown's release from prison, the Cayuga County office building had installed new security gates and an armed guard.
They were worried about security up there, yeah. And it was specifically because of him. He was immediately the first suspect in the eyes, in the minds of social service people, because he had made the threats. He was very angry, you know, he had a bad history, and it all fit together. It seemed to me that he was the kind of guy who might do that. And I'd had quite a bit of experience working with crooks.
Some police weren't so sure.
Everything that I had seen at the scene and everything that was being connected to Roy Brown didn't. I actually thought there was a lot stronger suspects. Well, I was kind of flabbergasted when it was making it through the district attorney's office, our investigation. Of course, Investigator Pinckney from the DA's office was present through most of the investigation. Whenever anybody was, from what I saw, whenever anybody was interviewed or something, he was up at the office quite a bit. It seemed like there was only two of us. There was one other fellow that kind of agreed with me that said, no, it doesn't fit. But it was us against a lot.
News of Roy Brown's arrest spread quickly.
You saw, there was a front page picture of Roy Brown on the Auburn Citizen that showed him with all these crazy eyes, and they referred to him as a Manson-like killer.
Brown was arrested after an interview with Syracuse police, DA's investigator Peter Pinckney, and Cayuga County investigators. Police said that even though Brown denied being involved in Kulikowski's death, the arrest was based on information brought out in the interview.
And there was like a certain sense of relief. This person was off the streets, and then they had this scenario where, you know, he was in Syracuse, he got drunk, he disappeared, and during that time that he could not account for his whereabouts, Sabina Kulikowski was killed.
While some social workers expressed relief at Brown's arrest, many others also expressed concerns about what had led the killer to target Sabina Kulikowski. Some expressed fears about more violence towards other social workers. Brown's trouble with social services had started when his daughter was put in foster care by Cayuga County. Brown had made his threats to Michael Mancini, who supervised Kulikowski. But no one had been able to find any connection or contact between Brown and Kulikowski. She had not worked on his daughter's case, and it did not appear that they had met. Other social workers wondered if Kulikowski had been singled out. Brown was charged with second-degree murder and first-degree burglary. District Attorney Paul Carbonaro said they were awaiting lab reports on the evidence collected at the crime scene and hoped to present the case to a grand jury soon. Brown was ordered held without bail. The trial started on a cold January morning. Roy Brown pled not guilty to all charges. He was represented by Syracuse defense attorney Jim McGraw.
I believed him. I was impressed by his sincerity. He was angry. He was getting a bad deal, and it clearly came through.
New Cayuga County District Attorney James Vargason would be prosecuting the case. He had inherited the case from Paul Carbonaro and Dennis Sedor. Vargason had beaten Sedor in the 1991 District Attorney's race. Only days after taking the job, Vargason was presenting a murder case to a jury. One of the first witnesses, Roy Brown's ex-wife. She testified that Brown had bitten her during fights, evidence the prosecution hoped would prove Roy was capable of the brutal attack.
You had motive, you had opportunity, you had a history of violence, he was a biter, and lo and behold, when confronted, he lies about where he was.
Brown had given conflicting statements about his activity the night of the murder. Witnesses had seen him in Syracuse, but his exact timeline was uncertain.
You have a former jail cellmate say that he made an admission to him.
An ex-convict named Gordon Wiggins testified that he had spoken to Brown on the phone at a party during the summer of 1991, and that Brown had told him he had killed Kulikowski and that she deserved it. The defense questioned Wiggins' story since Brown would have had to call collect from the Cayuga County Jail and could not have known Wiggins would be there.
They had some guy from jail who had said that Roy had confessed to him, and that guy was absolutely ridiculous at trial.
Several forensic experts also testified that there had been blood, hair, and saliva found at the scene, but they admitted on cross-examination that they were unable to link it to Roy Brown.
And then you have the forensic odontologist opine that the bite marks on Sabina came from Roy Brown's teeth.
The bite mark testimony was the crux of the prosecution's case. Dr. Edward Mofson testified that his bite impressions from Roy Brown matched the wounds.
This guy, they had taken photographs and impressions. He had transparencies. He overlaid the transparencies, and they all seemed to match. He used the word consistent, 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 highly consistent, consistent, all consistent with, consistent. In my opinion, Roy Brown made these marks.
But the bite mark evidence was clearly the critical evidence because there was very little other evidence, certainly no other physical evidence.
The critical evidence was about to have its first challenge.
If I recall, there was an assistant district attorney under the former DA who told me that I should check things out regarding Dr. Levine.
Dr. Lowell Levine was the director of forensic operations for the New York State Police. Former Assistant District Attorney Dennis Sedor revealed that he, DA Paul Carbonaro, and Dr. Mofson had met with Dr. Levine regarding Roy Brown. While Dr. Levine had not reached any final conclusions, it appeared that he had disagreed with Dr. Mofson's evaluations of the bite mark evidence.
And I brought this issue up, and I was told by the judge in no uncertain terms, after the prosecutor said that there were no notes or no reports, that I could call Levine as my own witness, vouch for his credibility, but I could not question him basically about the meat of what we believed his testimony would be.
Well, and I would have thought that on cross-examination that the district attorney would have said, now it's true that you didn't get all the reports that you needed to finish your opinion, right? And you didn't come to a final conclusion because you said you needed more information, which totally would have discredited him, and here we put on a witness who's been discredited.
After hearing the limitations that would be placed on his examination of Dr. Lowell Levine, the defense chose not to subpoena him. The prosecution kept their case as concise as possible and limited the number of police witnesses.
They also didn't call a lot of the people that were involved in the investigation. Some of the people that were involved in this investigation, where you would have had an opportunity to cross-examine them about why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that, or did you ever have any other suspects, they put on the scantiest case that you can imagine.
I'd never heard of such a thing. In 30 years, anytime an officer did something in the way of a case, either took a statement or collected evidence, and then that case went to trial, it was always the officer that took the photo or collected the evidence or took the statement, was the one that testified all the time. And I never testified to any of the photographs, any of the diagrams. No, I wasn't involved in the case, the trial at all. I wasn't called to testify. I believe ex-Sheriff Pinckney testified to all the work that I did that first week.
Laura, the defense has taken over in the murder trial of Roy Brown, and it was like a bombshell dropped on this courtroom when attorney James McGraw called an expert witness. That expert witness is Dr. Homer Campbell. He's a forensic dentist from New Mexico, a nationally recognized expert on bite marks.
Dr. Campbell's testimony was in direct contrast to the prosecution's expert.
There were 6 teeth marks on the skin, and of course he only has 4 upper teeth. The other 2 are rotted off at the gum and don't mark. And bite your own arm if you want to see what 6 teeth look like.
Roy Brown was missing his upper lateral incisors. The prosecution said that the folded skin of his mouth could leave an impression that showed a full bite pattern. Dr. Campbell's testimony was crucial to the defense.
He was their only witness. I think they thought they had a slam dunk.
There really wasn't anybody else to call. I mean, you're not going to call people to say that he didn't bite his wife, because who would know that? testimony from the jailhouse guy was so absurd that I didn't feel it was necessary to contradict that. The defense was, you know, forensic. These teeth marks could not have been caused by Roy, end of story.
Right, we didn't buy that.
As the defense rested, both sides prepared for their case to go to the jury.
Friends at social services and such, they were afraid he was going to get out of it. I was worried that the jury wouldn't understand it and that they wouldn't buy it, and because of the circumstantial nature of the rest of the case, he'd be let go.
Before the case could go to a jury, Judge Corning had to give the jurors their charge.
And when the judge was instructing the jury, he told the jury, very often inconsistencies will have the ring of truth. There's nothing in the criminal jury instructions, it doesn't make sense. And he tells the jury, don't worry about all the cross-examination that you heard, all the times these witnesses were tripped up. He tells the jury, very often inconsistencies will have the ring of truth. Never heard that instruction before, have never heard it since. It's not in the criminal jury instructions.
With that, the jurors went into the jury room to decide the case.
I remember thinking how important the case was to the community. I remember thinking how serious this is, and I remember thinking what a tragedy it was that this really wonderful person, who I didn't know, but many others provided testimonials to, you know, died such a horrible death. And how important it was that the person who was responsible for that be held accountable. It would be disingenuous of me if I didn't say I also remember thinking how important it was that as the new prosecutor that I be successful in this case, because the community obviously needs to have confidence in their elected officials.
It was a horrible crime. The jury knows how bad the crime was. They don't want somebody to get off if they did it, and they're going to be looking really hard.
We were all in touch. We were on edge. Is the jury back? We had sentinels, and we had spies who were going to call us as soon as they came out. And we all rushed over there and came in for the verdict.
Some people say if they come back early, it's good. Some people say if they come back late, it's not good. But in this case, I believe they deliberated about 5 hours, and I feel as though they came up with the right decision.
And as I understand it, the jurors, when they deliberated this, actually went into the jury room, got some of that evidence, looked it over, and laid over those, put the overlays over the bite mark pictures, and they were convinced. Totally convinced that those bite marks matched Roy Brown's.
Brown was found guilty of Sabina Kulikowski's murder.
We were all relieved. Oh, good. The guy got what he deserved.
Okay. Thank you. Anything said in the press?
I didn't even know that lady. Never knew who she was or anything.
Excuse it.
There are sufficient issues that were before this court that will pretty much guarantee a reversal of the conviction on appeal.
Would be in the guaranteeing business if I were him, but that's certainly his, his position with regard to this, and he's entitled to that.
You know, this is a serious thing. I never had anything like this in my life. And when it came time for, like, when they were sentencing me, the judge said, you know, you want to say something before sentencing? And when I said, I got something to say. You bury me for 1,000,000 years, I'm still going to be innocent.
Roy Brown's family was devastated.
You do everything you're supposed to do, and you just have your whole life wiped out from underneath you.
Folks have anything to say at all?
Auburn sucks.
All our mom did was spent every living moment she had from there on to prove his innocence. That's all she did. She just, day to day, phone calls.
Well, of course, we said we're going to file the direct appeal. You know, I was upset at the trial procedure. That bothers me. I don't do a lot of trial work. I do a lot of the law work, and just the way that was conducted, it really bothered me. And it bothered me that someone could find that that was proof beyond a reasonable doubt. When you're in trial, the burden of proof is on the people. They're supposed to have to prove you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in order to get a conviction. You're supposed to be presumed innocent. When you go to the appellate division, those presumptions are gone. You're presumed guilty. The burden of proof is on you to show that something went wrong at trial, and it has to be something significant that went wrong, or else they find harmless error. Right after trial, we got a phone call, an anonymous phone call from somebody that said they were involved in the investigation. They said there was an issue of boot print next to the body.
Some cop calls up and tells my lawyers, we've got boot prints. We go to court, Bargain says, I don't know anything about it. A week later, we go to court, oh, these ones. Yeah. Size 13, I wear 7.5.
Investigators said the boot prints were most likely those of a firefighter and were not considered relevant. Jim McGraw and Katie Karlovitz included this in the appeal along with other legal objections to rulings from the trial.
The decisions from the appellate division, you often don't get much in terms of content to them, but it was, the conviction was unanimously affirmed. They commented on a couple issues, and then the rest they just said, no, you know, harmless error, didn't make a difference type of thing.
As Roy's appeals were being denied, another Cayuga County murder appeal was more successful.
Thomas Bianco was convicted of the murder of Julie Monson. This was years prior to the murder of Sabina Kulikowski. He went to prison, and it turned out after he had been convicted and sent off to prison that there was evidence that became known to the defense that had apparently been withheld that would have been exculpatory, or at least pointed to another person as the killer of Julie Monson. At that point, it went before a judge, Judge Montserrat. And in his, Judge Montserrat not only ordered the immediate release of Thomas Bianco and setting aside the verdict, he also wrote in his decision that there should be an investigation into possible prosecutorial misconduct. The people that made the case against Roy Brown were the same that made the case somewhat with Thomas Bianco, Paul Carbonaro, that was the district attorney. There was this thought at the time that if they could allegedly frame Thomas Bianco, could the same people allegedly frame Roy Brown?
My mom just told me, she said, you know, if you don't give up, you're not going to lose. You know, once you give up the fight, you lost.
Katie Karlovitz and Jim McGraw filed an application to the Court of Appeals, but the court declined to hear the case. It did not stop Roy Brown from proclaiming his innocence.
He didn't care of the consequences that he would suffer in prison as a result of not admitting his guilt. One of the first things they do to you when somebody goes into prison is to make them admit their guilt. And what we were finding here with Roy Brown, despite all the hell they put him through to try to get him to say, yes, I killed Sabina Kulikowski, he refused, constantly refused.
For my mom, it was hell. It was pure hell. I mean, he would have his good days and his bad days, but she was always his sounding board. He'd call her up no matter what. And, you know, if things were too bad, she'd call his counselor, and the counselor would put him on something to calm him down a little bit. But honestly, she's probably the biggest thing that kept him going.
He began a quest at that point to try to get the courts to release evidence for DNA testing. Sabina Kulikowski was bitten, and there was saliva samples that were taken by police at the scene, and there was this red T-shirt that was supposedly soaked with it. He and I had this correspondence going on, so I convinced the station here to do a special report, to take another look, and at this point, this was after the O.J. Simpson case. DNA evidence was suddenly becoming the big thing in murder cases.
It's a story of high-tech criminology and the notorious murder of Sabina Kulikowski 3 years ago. The convicted killer is trying now to have saliva taken from the body of the victim analyzed for DNA. He says these microscopic building blocks of molecular structure will prove he is not a murderer.
There's millions of DNAs in each one of these samples they can compare to me.
At first, you know, I thought my story would be like this. I would be able to convince the station to pay for DNA testing of evidence. So I thought it'd be simple. We could go to the DA, Vargason, and say, could you, you know, let's take this evidence and we'll send it to a laboratory. We'll take care of all the chain of custody and everything else, and have it tested. And Vargason was like puzzled. Why would I ever want to try to pull off something like this? I got price quotes and everything from various laboratories, and then the DA basically said no. He would oppose us at every step of the way.
Roy also expressed his outrage at the prosecution's theory of how he allegedly murdered Kulikowski.
You've never been in a town before and say, gee, that house looks like it must be a social worker's house, and she must be home alone. There is no chance. There is no chance like that. That's mad.
Jim Vargason countered that the jury had good reason to come to their verdict.
In the long run, they felt that, I believe anyways, that Dr. Mopson's analysis was correct. You know, and combine that together with the very compelling circumstantial evidence which was presented in this case, you know, brought them to the conclusion that this man was the guilty person.
Roy and his attorneys filed a 440 motion for DNA testing of the swabs and were denied.
Those were down years for Roy. And all he ever needed really was that glimmer of hope out there.
And for the Brown family, their beacon of hope was fading.
You know, I was with my mother the last day, you know, of her life, and that was one of her hopes was, you know, don't give up on your brother.
If people really want to know the sadness, they ought to know what it's like to have your brother shackled showing up at your mother's funeral. Because that honestly was the most heartbreaking thing out of anything.
I have a whole stack of letters from Roy, and you know, you read them and you see him go through certain phases. One was anger. Sometimes they were humorous. You know, desperation. At one point, you were almost getting an impression that maybe he was reconciling himself to the fact that he might be in prison for the rest of his life.
The painting on the third floor of the Cayuga County office building shows Sabina Kulikowski in the prime of her life and working with children. The scene shows her beauty of life and not the tragedy of her death. 10 years later, she was still near the hearts of those who knew her. Jim Vargason was still Cayuga County's district attorney. Former investigator Peter Pinkney was now the Cayuga County sheriff. He beat out former undersheriff Richard Noga. For Roy Brown, those years had brought changes in health concerns. He continued to proclaim his innocence, to little avail. In 2002, Jim Kenyon again did a story for WSTM on Roy Brown's appeal. The report included a key interview. Roy Brown's ex-wife, Kim. In the years since the murder, she had a lot to think about. Kim Brown had testified against him at the original trial, but now claimed that she believed Roy to be innocent. She also revealed that she had been on the phone with him the night of the murder, and she doubted he was in any condition to commit the crime.
And he was way too drunk to go all the way out there, do this, and cover everything up.
In the report, Roy talked about the appeal he was filing.
The first thing I'm asking for is DNA testing. Should they grant me DNA testing, they won't have to look at the rest of it because I can prove myself innocent, just like that.
Jim Vargason explained the position of the district attorney's office.
There is a law that does give convicted defendants under appropriate circumstances the right to have DNA testing, but they must meet the minimum thresholds. And in fact, in this case, Roy Brown's never been able to do that.
Jim Kenyon's report was not a big hit with the DA's office.
When you know, at that point, when I did the story in 2002, he was furious, just furious. He wrote a letter to my general manager that was very nasty, and basically said that I was manipulative and I questioned my professionalism and everything else.
In the end, the story showed Roy Brown had made virtually no progress in his appeals.
Every time he'd file a motion, thrown out of court, you know, he'd send me all these legal papers and that he put together himself, you know, and he had all these hopes that somebody in the federal court would listen to him, or someone in a state appellate division would listen to him, and he'd get turned down at every step of the way.
Today, Sheriff Peter Pickney, a Cayuga County civil servant for 35 years, the county's top cop, was handcuffed, put in the back of a police car, and taken to court for arraignment.
At the time of the Roy Brown murder, he worked for the DA's office. He was their prime investigator. Peter Pinkney became sheriff afterwards, and then he left office in disgrace under a corruption investigation in which he was actually arrested and charged himself.
Pinkney was convicted of stealing from a drug task force fund and sentenced to 2 months in jail with 5 years of probation. Around the same time, Roy Brown's family was trying to get some movement on his case.
At some point, his family wanted to make a copy of the file. They wanted to pick it up from us. They were, you know, we had told them that we didn't know what else to do at that time. Yeah, we wanted DNA testing. We'd been denied under the law at the time, and just weren't going to get anywhere on what we had at that time. So they wanted to pick up the file, make copies. They took the file to one of Roy's relatives' house. There was a fire, and the file was burned. Most of it was lost. I have some pages that were just charred around the edges, but they lost a significant portion of what was in Roy's file. And so Roy wanted to replace the documents that had been burned at his family's home, sent the FOIL request to Auburn.
Well, there had been other Freedom of Information requests requested over the years on this case, and they were filled. But this last one in 2003, I was just getting ready to retire, and Sheriff Pinkney was gone. He was out of office, and it was my responsibility as ID officer to make sure that these FOIL requests are filled, but usually they always came through the sheriff. Then either myself or the records clerk would make sure that they got filled. The request was for statements, and I went into my evidence room and obtained the tote boxes, the records, took them to the records clerk and told her to run Mr. Brown a copy of every statement in there. She wondered, there was so much. How much? What do I send, or what am I supposed to send? How much do you want me to do? And the time involved, and I said, run him a copy of everything. And it's going to cost him so much a sheet, but run him everything.
And they sent them to me. I'm reading these things and I'm going, wait a minute.
There were several statements that Roy and his attorneys had never seen before. 4 statements in particular stood out. The first one was from Barry Bench, the brother of Sabina Kulikowski's estranged boyfriend. Barry Bench's statement describes a strange night out, starting with a description of having what he calls a slight domestic with his common-law wife, Tamara Heisner, and then going out to have a few drinks at Jake's Tavern in Aurelius. He says he left Jake's Tavern between 12:30 and 1 a.m., drove home and went by it, blowing the horn as I did. Tammy then left the house and met me at the firehouse. He then goes on to say that he and Tammy went home. He turned off the fire monitor he had as a member of the volunteer fire department and went to bed. He says he was then woken up by his neighbor, Mike Besner, who informed him that the farmhouse was on fire. The next statement was from Tamara Heisner. She describes Barry as pretty well intoxicated and elaborates on the meeting at the firehouse. She says that Barry went inside the firehouse at 1:30 in the morning to wash up his face and arms.
Going to the fire barn and washing your face and hands after you've been out drinking in a bar, I've seen Jake's Tavern when it was in business. You might want to wash after you're there, but going to the fire barn, changing clothes, and that's odd behavior. It's certainly consistent with somebody who's covering something up.
After arriving at the smoldering farmhouse the next morning, Tamara mentions that Barry appeared to be looking for something along the side of the road. The next two affidavits were from Mike and Tina Besner, who lived across the street from Barry Bench and Tamara Heisner. Mike Besner was also a Cayuga County fire dispatcher, and they described trying to reach Barry Bench to tell him that his family's farmhouse was on fire. Mike Besner made numerous calls to Barry and Tamara with no answer, and his wife knocked on the front door repeatedly and yelled out Tammy's name. After an hour of attempts, Tamara answered the phone and said that they had been sleeping. Tina Besner's statement goes on to describe a conversation she had with Tamara Heisner. Tina says that in a conversation later that day, Tamara said she and Barry parked behind the fire trucks. While walking up to the fire, Barry was looking all around. She asked him what he was doing, and he replied, "I'm trying to find evidence, or find Sabina." She was later quite concerned that the body was found right where he was looking.
He tells his girlfriend, "I'm looking for evidence." Evidence for what? Nobody said a crime was committed, man. The fire's up the hill or over the hill, whatever. You're down the road looking for a body. Yeah. Who knows there's a body?
Looking in that area and looking down and looking for her there, and tell somebody that. Now, nobody knew where she was at that point in time. Nobody, except somebody that had been involved or had some inside information.
Almost 12 years after the murder, Roy had a new lead, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act request he had paid for with his prison earnings.
That's the biggest return on $10 or whatever it was that I've ever seen.
Roy had never heard Barry Bench's name before that day, but with each affidavit he read, he wanted to get to know him better.
Here I'm sitting another Christmas in jail, and Christmas has always been a big part of my life. My mom and my family, it's like a gathering, and it ain't been the same since I've been in prison for him. So I figure, this guy's out here celebrating Christmas again, so I'm just gonna write him a letter.
Convinced that Barry Bench had killed Sabina Kulikowski, Roy's letter wasted no time in getting to the point. He wrote, "Since Peter Pinckney has been himself arrested and exposed, you don't have anyone to conceal things for you. The mere fact that these statements have been hidden is significant. Otherwise, why hide the statements and your identity and existence?
I'm coming to get you for DNA testing. That's what I told him I'm going to do."
Witnesses can commit perjury, judges can be fooled, and juries can make mistakes. When it comes to DNA testing, there's no mistakes. The letter ends with a final holiday message. "Well, Christmas is tomorrow. My gift to you is, mark my words, they will eventually find out your guilt. Have a Merry Christmas, but don't count on a Happy New Year. May you reach and find God before God reaches and finds you."
If I sent you a letter accusing you of something pretty serious, you'd be calling a lawyer, calling the police. I don't want this guy writing to me. He didn't do any of that. He threw himself in front of a train.
4 days after Christmas, an Amtrak engineer reported that the train had hit a man lying on the tracks. Barry Bench was killed instantly. Roy was so excited about the information he had uncovered that he decided to file a motion to vacate his conviction on his own.
I know he thought, because I've talked to him, this is it. He's got to vacate the conviction based on what I know now. And Roy had been at the law library a lot and been doing all this stuff, so he filed the pro se motion. I think he would have liked to have done it on his own. And when you look at the response from the district attorney's office, it wasn't from Jim Vargas, it was from Christopher Valdina, all based on conversations with other people in the office. Normally you would have an affidavit that I turned over these documents. They didn't say that because it wasn't true. They couldn't say that. They said, we think we did, but if we didn't, it doesn't matter because they're not exculpatory. They don't prove anything. It's not enough. Judge Corning said, yeah, you're right, it's not enough. Boom.
And the rules of evidence and the rules of discovery are very clear, which are this. One, if it's a witness statement who's going to testify at trial, you have to disclose it because it's known as Rosario. If it's exculpatory, you have to disclose it because it's Brady. This statement did not fit under either of those rules because Barry Bench did not testify at trial, so therefore it's not Rosario, and it's just his account of what he was doing that evening.
And I know Jim Vargas says that they weren't exculpatory. They tended to prove that Roy was innocent. There's certainly something that had we had them in our possession, we would have used them at trial, and we would have put another, that certainly would have created a reasonable doubt for any jury. I was shocked. And my first thought was, there's got to be more police reports that we didn't get, because they had to have talked to Barry Bench and Tamara Heisner again. Knowing this, they had to go back and re-interview them, and then I thought, okay, calm down. They must have gone back to Barry Bench and found out that he was in church that night, and there were 6 priests and 10 nuns that witnessed him in church that night from 5 p.m. till 4 in the morning, even though his affidavit didn't say that. I thought, okay, maybe he had an alibi or something. So I wanted to find out what they found out on the second interview or third interview with Barry Bench in the course of their investigation. Of course, Barry Bench isn't available. Tamara Heisner tells me, I don't know the time frame exactly, they never came back and talked to her again.
Even though Roy's motion had been denied, Katie Karlowitz still saw an opportunity to push for DNA testing.
I wanted to get something that would prove Roy's innocence. I didn't know if we could prove Barry Bench's guilt with those affidavits. It certainly pointed in that direction. But Roy was concerned too with proving his innocence, and I said, let's use these to get DNA testing.
Katie Karlowitz also wondered if the testing could be done in time. For Roy Brown, time had grown short. He had developed hepatitis C, and his liver was failing him.
When I interviewed him in 2006 in prison, and I saw him, I had been told by his family that he was doing poorly. In fact, may even be at death's door. And when I finally got to meet him and I saw this thin, emaciated man with yellow skin and everything, I was shocked.
Roy's condition was serious. He desperately needed a transplant, and the prison doctors were concerned that his liver would fail at any time. The years brought other changes in Roy.
I don't know exactly where it was that I learned it or I felt it, but it came down to where, it doesn't really matter, because when I get to heaven, none of this matters. What matters is a person was murdered, a person got away with it, and it shouldn't have happened.
He's very, as I say, he's a very smart man, and he sees things from a far different perspective. I mean, think about it. If you're in prison every day for 15 years, there's a lot of things that go on in your mind, and that changed him. It changed him, and rather than turn it into anger and vengeance, I think he turned it into something that was something more calming for him.
Because proving myself innocent is freedom, man. Freedom ain't like on this side of the wall or that side of the wall. It's something I've been carrying with me ever since they threw these chains on me.
Roy had also faced his own demons while in prison and took a long look at his troubled past and why he had threatened social workers.
I never started drinking until I couldn't see my kids. And I didn't go out and get hammered and, that's my medication. You know what I'm saying? When the pain got too bad, I'd have another beer, and that was it, and when it got real bad, I'd have a lot of beers, and as much as I miss my kids, I turned into an alcoholic, and it came time when I quit for 11 months, until they took my kid away, and then I got into a bottle of whiskey, didn't drink it all, got sick as a dog, but I called that guy up and said, well, I'll just come over there and shoot you. Not a really good thing to do, pretty childish, I guess, but when you're drunk and stupid and you're emotionally upset because you can't see your kid, she didn't have no mother. I was the only thing she had, so, basically that's what it boiled down to.
I didn't file an appeal. I said, we got something to work with. I said, Roy, we got to do something bigger with this. Let me just, and at that point, I begged the Innocence Project to get involved.
Thousands of convicts asked the Innocence Project for help every year, but Katie Karlowitz's letter made an impression on staff attorney Nina Morrison.
There were a few things about the case that raised red flags for us from the beginning. One is the fact that he was convicted almost entirely on this bite mark evidence, which by the time we got the letter in about 2004, we knew was junk science. We knew that there was no basis for any forensic scientist to say, I can look at this bite mark on a body and I can look at someone's teeth and tell you to a scientific certainty that they came from the same person. You just can't do that. And that evidence is incredibly persuasive to juries, and the fact that it figured so heavily in Roy's case made us really think there may be something to his innocence claim. Certainly worth a look.
Nina Morrison and Peter Neufeld from the Innocence Project took Roy Brown's case. When they learned of Roy's fading health, they didn't waste any time. A 2004 change in state law had made it easier for convicts to get new or additional state-of-the-art DNA testing on old forensic evidence, and Nina Morrison used it to get a hearing before Judge Corning. For the first time since 1992, Roy Brown would be in Cayuga County Court.
I sat at the foot of that floor there looking out the window all night watching the sun come up, you know. Couldn't get to sleep because I was sick. The liver wouldn't go to sleep. So, but I just watched the sun come up behind it, you know, or come up in front of it, I should say, and hit it. And as soon as it hit it, CO said, get ready, you're going to court. I've been ready for 15 years, I told him.
Yeah, yep, take a left.
Roy was incredibly sick. He could barely walk. His skin was yellow. He just looked like he was holding on for dear life.
Judge Corning allowed DNA testing of material on 2 cotton swabs taken from the bite marks on Sabina Kulikowski's body. Jim Vargason did not oppose the motion, but warned he would oppose any further testing of other evidence. In response to the Innocence Project's inclusion of Barry Bench's affidavits, the judge wrote, "Fanciful theories and allegations that attempt to incriminate others as the real murderer serve no legitimate purpose in this inquiry." There was also no guarantee that the cotton swabs held any answers.
It's a distinct possibility that there's not enough DNA there to get a conclusive result. So in that sense, we're not confident, but hopefully there's enough DNA to test.
Due to Roy's failing health, the test was put on a fast track at the crime laboratory.
We just hope he lasts long enough to get the results of this and that he gets out of prison.
My time to go, I'm not asking to stay. I just want to prove my innocence before I leave.
Katie Karlovitz and the Innocence Project claimed that the affidavits raised questions about the night Sabina Kulikowski died, questions that Barry Bench couldn't answer. The only answers might come from the one person who had seen Barry Bench that night.
My statement and Barry's obviously could put him at the scene. The time frame was ideal for him to be there.
Tamara Heisner, Barry Bench's common-law wife, is the only person known to have seen him after midnight on the night of the murder. When she met up with him, he was washing up at the firehouse.
He had done that before in times past. He had gone up there and changed, you know, if he had gone on an ambulance call or a fire call, he would change up there and then come home. So that's not unheard of, but for that night, it would have been unusual.
When they got home, she says Barry turned off his fire monitor.
That was very strange. That was unheard of for him to do that.
She describes Barry Bench as unusually calm the next morning and confirmed what she told the police in her statement.
Somehow he mentioned that we should both go up and down the sides of the road and look in the side of the road in the ditch for any evidence. Little did I know that I actually walked pretty much right past where Sabina had been.
In your opinion, do you think Roy Brown is guilty of Miss Sabina's murder?
No, absolutely not. Not at all.
Do you think it's possible that Barry Bench could have committed this crime?
It's definitely possible. I mean, like I said, the time frame was there. He was physically possible to do it. I could never picture him being that vicious, but you know, we had a violent history, so it's definitely possible.
As the interview with Tamara Heisner wrapped up, the boot print that had been photographed next to Sabina's body came up.
It's Barry's size. Barry Bench wore a size 13 and always wear boots.
It took the crime lab a little more than a month to confirm Katie Karlovitz's fears.
The cotton swabs were tested, and there wasn't DNA that was usable found on those cotton swabs. So then back to pushing Jim Vargason to allow, to consent to testing of the other items.
There were a series of items. There was the swab, and there were the fingernail clippings, there was the vaginal swab, and then there was the T-shirt. The T-shirt is where they found in 1991, they found 7 salivary amylase stains. But the issue with the T-shirt, why we saved that for last, is because there was an issue of potential contamination with the T-shirt, because it had been handled numerous times.
In court paperwork, Jim Vargason explained that the shirt had been handled by witnesses at trial, had gone into the jury room, and in one letter he theorized that a dog may have carried it in its mouth.
So the concern was you don't want to get a DNA test that is, basically corrupted by virtue of the fact of foreign DNA that had nothing to do with the crime.
Our response to that was, look, you can actually test the areas right around the bite marks where they found saliva 15 years ago. So we knew, because they had done chemical tests for saliva, that those particular stains had been positive for saliva. So we're not just talking about stray DNA.
DNA testing is pretty sophisticated, and I think even the first-year DNA testing students can probably tell dog DNA from human DNA.
We then met with Judge Corning and Mr. Vargason in his chambers probably 2 or 3 times over the summer for some long negotiations to talk about it. And I was actually on vacation in the end of August for a few days, and I got a phone call on my cell phone from the judge saying that he decided he was going to allow the rest of the DNA test to go forward.
On August 23, 2006, Judge Corning ordered testing of all remaining evidence, including the T-shirt.
My sense was that they realized that we were going to get the DNA testing one way or another, whether from that court or from an appeals court, and why drag it out and let's just get this on with, which, you know, we appreciated because Roy was a very sick man.
Most of the 15-year-old samples did not yield any reasonable results, but the locations on the T-shirt that had tested positive for saliva in 1991 gave DNA profiles.
They tested the DNA, got a mixture of 2 individuals. One of those individuals was male and the other was female. They tested 2 people to see if they matched that DNA. One was Sabina Kulikowski, the other was Roy Brown. Sabina Kulikowski clearly was one of the 2 people in that mix, but Roy Brown was not. So we knew there was a male in that mixture who wasn't Roy Brown. At the time, because we don't know who it is, they label it John Doe.
Nina Morrison and Katie Karlovitz had a suspicion about who John Doe was and went to Barry Bench's ex-wife to see if she could help them prove it.
So an investigator that we hired went to talk to Tamara. She was very gracious, agreed to talk to us, and immediately said both that Barry was a very violent man and also that if there was any possibility he was involved in this murder, she wanted to do everything she could to find out. And her daughter, who was with her, said, could I give a DNA sample of my own so that we could see if my father really committed this crime. First, she wanted to know the truth, but second, she knew that if there was a man in prison and her father hadn't had the courage to admit what he'd done before he died, she could certainly play her part in helping to get him free, and she and her mother both saw that as their moral obligation.
And she consents to give a DNA sample, and God bless her for doing that.
It's one of the most decent gestures I've ever seen from the family of a victim. She was very concerned, quite frankly, about ensuring that Roy Brown didn't spend any more time in jail if he was innocent.
And sure enough, there's a 99.9% or something in the neighborhood likelihood that she's the daughter of John Doe, the person who saliva is on the T-shirt. Walking on air with those results. And Nina Morrison warned me, she goes, you know, this isn't going to be enough for Jim Vargason, you know that.
Roy Brown is scheduled to appear in court behind me at 2 o'clock today, where lawyers for...
Morning, how are you? The DA, Jim Vargason, has filed papers with the court in preparation for the hearing, opposing Roy Brown's attempt to get freedom from prison. So we'll have...
Roy, you want to say anything?
In court, Jim Vargason opposed Roy Brown's release and asked for time to investigate the DNA results further. Judge Corning also told attorneys that he found the original bite mark evidence compelling and that the new DNA test did not outweigh it in his opinion.
I was really offended, frankly, mostly by the straws that the judge and the prosecutor were grasping at as a way to explain the inexplicable. To say that there could be, as Jim Vargason did, any number of plausible, innocent explanations as to why Barry Bench's DNA would be all over that shirt and Roy's wouldn't be, and to say, as the judge did, that the bite mark evidence, in his opinion from 15 years ago, looking at some photographs, was more persuasive than state-of-the-art DNA science, was really surprising and really offensive, frankly. It insulted our intelligence and insulted the intelligence of the community, and it looked like a desperate move to keep Roy from getting out of prison.
If Roy Brown did not murder Sabina Kulikowski, he should not serve one more second in prison. I think everybody agrees with that, and I do too. It would be a tragedy. If Roy Brown did in fact murder Sabina Kulikowski, and according to the jury he did, and we consented to that conviction being vacated and he was released, and we discovered an innocent explanation why Barry Bench's DNA is on that shirt, and or we discovered through the dental records that he did in fact leave or could not have left those impressions. That's a tragedy also.
In order to believe that the results we had didn't prove it was from Barry Bench, you would have had to believe that this woman, Catherine Eckstadt, who grew up all the time, her whole life, believing Barry Bench was her father, a man who acknowledged from birth he was her father, where there was no allegation anyone else was her father, who himself committed suicide after being confronted with an allegation he was the killer, was actually not the killer and not her father, but her real father, some mystery man out there, was the actual killer. I mean, it's absurd. And I said as much in court. You know, I almost felt like I was in some Twilight Zone where I'm sort of saying, Judge, what Mr. Vargason is arguing essentially is, you know, this fantasy scenario.
But Corning did not go along with it, and he sent Roy Brown back to prison.
Just days before Christmas, Roy Brown was going back to prison.
You know, I thought if I came in here and proved I didn't do it, they'd let you go. With all the other cases, that's what they do. You prove you didn't do something, they let you go. Here they want me to prove who John Doe is and why he did it, maybe. I don't know what the next step would be.
Before going back, Roy gave his thanks to Barry Bench's daughter.
I'm very thankful for their courage and their honesty.
You know, he was sick. He was very sick, and he was going back into a prison system where he could have very well died.
This would be the last hearing before Judge Corning. Another hearing was scheduled for January, after his retirement. Later that afternoon, Jim Vargason told reporters that he had asked the Cayuga County Sheriff's Department to further investigate Barry Bench's possible involvement.
My view of it is, what was his motive? Why would he do this? And Roy Brown had a motive, and Roy Brown had made the threats. So my view of it is that he was interviewed. It was concluded that his story was consistent with others who had been interviewed as to where he was and what he was doing. Obviously, in hindsight, it would have been better to follow up on that. But again, you know, I'm not looking at this as though we have evidence that Barry Bench murdered Sabina Kulikowski. We don't. We have evidence that raises serious questions.
But a man served 15 years in prison for a murder that he still claims he didn't commit, and only now has your office ordered an investigation into Barry Bench's alibi.
Well, when would you have wanted me to do it, Mr. Kenyon? The DNA evidence wasn't discovered until a couple of weeks ago, and allegedly Barry Bench's DNA as being on that shirt was not discovered until about 10 days ago. First and foremost, as I explained to the court and I explained to Roy Brown's attorneys, we need to know for certain who John Doe is. And the experts in Albany tell me there is only one way to determine who John Doe is.
The next morning, the body of Barry Bench was exhumed. The state police would compare his DNA to the John Doe profile. With Roy Brown's next hearing just a month away, there was a lot to do.
We thought that we were going to have a contested hearing where we were going to have to call expert witnesses to fight about what this DNA meant. You know, it was also very busy because we knew that the state was doing a lot of investigation. We were getting a lot of calls from witnesses they were going to talk to. We had a lot of logistics to deal with, but emotionally it was also very stressful because we didn't know whether we were looking at a fight of weeks or months or years, or whether Roy was actually going to go home in January.
Roy's family was hopeful that he would finally be able to come home.
I'm putting the faith in the judge that he's going to do the right thing tomorrow.
We're all, hoping that Bargeson don't have another, joker up his sleeve.
They gonna release him today?
With Judge Corning retired, Roy's hearing was in front of Judge Mark Fandrick.
We did know at that point that we had a new judge, someone who was fair-minded and who we believed would take an objective look at the evidence. So we were pretty confident, but you never know in this business. I've had clients who had DNA results for 3, 4, 5 years before they were let out of prison, and there was no reason to think Roy's case would necessarily be any different.
The hearing had more than a new judge. The proceedings had a very different tone.
Today, the hearing was about whether he met his threshold. Was he entitled to have his judgment of conviction overturned? And I agreed. He was. John Doe is Barry Bench. Barry Bench is John Doe.
What happened?
Coming home, they're signing papers.
He's a free man. America, he said it.
Yeah.
Right? Roy, how do you feel? You're a free man.
I feel pretty good.
15 years is a long time. Tell me, what's the first thing you're going to do with your family?
Go eat.
15 years to the day after he had been convicted, Roy Brown was going home.
Hold on. We're almost there. All right.
Get the hell out of here, man.
Peter, I'm over here. Peter, I'm over here. I'm gonna walk down
As a prosecutor, your job is to learn the truth. I mean, the goal should always be to get it right.
Lord, the Sandman done us wrong, but our flag's so strong. Lord, we can carry that pain. I'm holding my candle out in your rain. I'm holding my candle out in your rain.
Although Roy's conviction was overturned, he was still indicted for the murder. Jim Vargason requested time to further investigate Barry Bench's alibi and determine if there was any link between Roy Brown and Barry Bench.
It came out in court today that a leading forensic expert in New York State examined the bite marks and found those bite marks likely belonged to Barry Bench and not Roy Brown. Barry Bench, of course.
Vargason also revealed that the bite mark evidence had been reevaluated by the same man who had started the analysis in 1991, Dr. Lowell Levine of the New York State Police.
This is the original file that I had in 1991.
Dr. Levine's notes show he had a meeting with District Attorney Paul Carbonaro, Assistant DA Dennis Sidor, and prosecution witness Dr. Edward Mofson in September of 1991.
In the thing that I thought was the best bite mark, I had a note that said, if upper, exclude. And this was because Roy Brown had no upper or maxillary lateral incisors, the two teeth next to the two big fat ones on the top and the front. And so I was tending to exclude Mr. Brown.
The notes of that meeting were never turned over to defense attorneys in 1991.
It's alarming to me that when they consult an expert of their choice who's with the state police, and certainly is, I'm not saying he would offer any bias towards wanting to help the prosecution in some sense, and I'm not saying that his opinions are biased, but who tells them this guy didn't do it, he couldn't have done it, yeah, that's alarming. And they proceed with the prosecution. That's alarming.
In early 2007, Jim Vargason contacted Dr. Levine to evaluate the bite marks again, with some new materials to compare it to.
Mr. Bench, and this is a segment of the jaw that was recovered in the exhumation, the most useful thing to work with was an X-ray film that had been taken on Barry Bench during life, incident to dental treatment, that showed that in the year 2000, or whenever it was taken, but after the crime, he had an upper left lateral incisor. Based upon everything that we had, the jaw fragments from the exhumation, the X-ray films that we clarified, the photographs of the bite marks that we digitized and clarified, I was able to come to some opinions. One is that because there were similar characteristics in the bite marks on the back, the arm, and the leg, it looked like they were all done by the same person. The second opinion, because of the presence of the lateral incisor, was that Mr. Bench could have done the bite marks. Not that he did, but that he could have. And finally, Mr. Brown absolutely, positively could not have caused the bite mark injury.
With this information, Jim Vargason asked the new Cayuga County Sheriff to investigate why there had been no further investigation of Barry Bench in 1991.
The Barry Bench statement was taken, it was reviewed by an investigator, and it was reviewed by an investigator's supervisor at the time and was signed off on and filed in a box someplace. I think it's fair to say that that was a failure.
And Vargas said, oh, we conducted our investigation. That's not your investigation, that's my investigation. That's my investigation. I did it on the floor myself. My sister's driving around in the middle of snowstorms trying to find areas and find maps. If the DNA didn't match Barry Bench, if my calculations were wrong, where would I be? Sitting in prison.
Yeah, when you're not doing legal work, you just spend like 12 hours a day playing guitar for 15 years.
I was gonna say, you get to practice and you get to...
I went down to my old neighborhood, it's all gone. My friends' houses, I figured go see if they still live there or their mom's still, houses are gone. Obviously they moved away. Trees are all gone, the city's changed. Everything's all computerized. So I kind of stay in, because I can't, it's gonna take 15 years to try to adjust to all this stuff, the computer stuff. I can turn the phone off and on. You know, there's no cords to it. You can take it anywhere you want to go. You know, they had two-way calling when I was arrested. You know, you push the thing down and you can get another call. Yeah, they didn't have any of that up.
This is a song about the tragedies of life, you know.
Know anything about tragedy?
All right.
Up
Dig that, huh?
Pretty good.
Yeah, because it's like my last trip here too, you know? I ain't coming back to this town for nothing. My kids live out here, I take a bus, see you in Syracuse. If he apologizes, they were gonna go easy on him.
If they don't, they're gonna give him hell.
Right, and Peter Newfield said, let's give him hell anyway, and I'm saying, yeah, let's kick his ass.
Yeah. Hey, Bill. Hey, how are you? Good.
In court, Jim Vargason agreed to drop all charges against Roy Brown. In regard to the 15 years Roy spent in prison, Vargason said, I can honestly say I regret that very much.
I probably have more evidence now to indict and try Barry Bench if he were alive than Roy Brown. There's no question about it. So from a practical standpoint, you draw certain logical conclusions from it, which is it's very likely that the murderer is somebody other than Roy Brown. And if somebody wants to then say, does that mean he's innocent? Well, in the eyes of the law, yes.
It was so good for me to watch Roy hear somebody apologize. He hadn't heard that at all before.
Is that the evidence strongly points to someone else. Your job is to get it right. That's your job. And you operate on the premise that the ends don't justify the means. And I think perhaps more than most, that has to ring true as a prerequisite for any prosecutor. And it's a gut check when you learn that maybe you didn't get it right and that somebody's freedom has been denied them for 15 years. It is a very difficult thing to go into that courtroom and know that you had a hand, and not an insignificant one either, in depriving someone of their freedom.
What my question to Roy is, were you framed?
Yes. Yeah, I would say that's put it mildly framed.
Had Dr. Levine's conclusions been given proper weight way back when, had the rantings of a jailhouse informant been properly vetted way back when, Roy Brown would have had 15 more years of his life to enjoy.
I don't know if you can say the criminal justice system went wrong. You have people in the justice system that didn't do what they were obligated to do, what they had a moral obligation to do, and that's where it went wrong. And I don't know what you can do about that. And I don't know how those people could sleep every night knowing that.
For Sabina Kulikowski's friends, Roy Brown's exoneration took away the answers that had given them peace.
We could understand partially why she was dead and how she died, and that was what we needed. The way it stands now, we don't really know what happened anymore or why. That's what's bothering me. And the fact that we could make the same mistake
again with somebody else, maybe not now with the DNA, but that we were so convinced.
The other night it was blizzard out, snowstorm. So I go outside and walk around the block 2 times. Spent about 25 minutes on the snow. Come in, person says, what the hell are you doing? So I was walking around. He's in the blizzard? And I said, yeah. He said, what are you, crazy? I said, no, man, freedom's great. That to me is experimenting. You know, trying to go on a computer, forget all that for right now, you know? Just to go out and be able to walk around the block. You know, whether it's snowing or not, you're freezing, freedom's great, man. You know?